Now, on this day in 1962, Wales Today went on air for the very first time. To celebrate our 50th birthday, we're bringing you special reports all this week, looking back at 5 decades of news broadcasting.
Yeah, from the stories that shaped our lives to the reporters and presenters who brought the news to our homes. Tonight, Carwyn Jones reports on the 1960s and those early years of Wales Today.
It may have been the beginning of the sophisticated 60s, but television broadcasting back then was still pretty basic. Wales Today's first home was a studio in this converted church in Cardiff, and it was from here that the first programme was broadcast at 6:10 on the 17th of September 1962. Its presenter was Brian Hoey.
Hello and good evening to you on this most important day in the history of the BBC in Wales.
The first time the music came on for Wales Today, your butterflies start going in your tummy and all the rest of it. Very, very exciting. And of course, they were the days when technology wasn't as it is now. There was no autocue, so you had to remember what you were doing. We'd had limited experience because prior to that, for a few years, we'd had a 5-minute bulletin on television, and it was simply reading the news to camera 5 minutes. The first newsreader ever was a young man by the name of Michael Aspel. Whatever happened to him?
I read the news today, oh boy.
Wales Today had only been on air a few months when the country was brought to a standstill in the big freeze of '63. As lorries struggled to get vital supplies through to homes, journalists struggled to get that footage on air.
Everything had to be brought back to the studio, and it was all on film, of course, so you had to allow time for the film editor to do his work, and I can remember, oh dear, many a stressful scene.
As Wales embraced the swinging 60s, Wales Today was there to capture the mood. It reported on the Beatles' visit to Bangor, the emergence of a certain singer from Tiger Bay, and it even followed a young Tom Jones as he recorded one of his early hits.
I'm told that you appeal to middle-aged women as much as to the teenagers. Why do you think this is?
Well, in the fan mail, you know, a lot of middle-aged people write to the fan club, and they say that they like it because somebody with a voice has got on. They think I've got a good voice, so I'm very pleased about that. Yeah.
Well, do you think the others haven't?
Oh, I don't know. I wouldn't say that. That's what they say.
The 60s was the decade of revolution, and in Wales, the tinderbox of change was True Erin. The decision to flood the valley to provide water for Liverpool awoke a new mood of political protest.
If our communities are destroyed, that is our own responsibility.
But on the streets, protest turned to direct action and the rise of the Free Wales Army.
And on top of the slurry is a human chain of buckets, picks.
Wales Today's reporters were often first on the scene, and that proved the case on Friday, the 21st of October, 1966. A young Peter Walker was one of the first journalists at Aberfan.
I started to ask the residents that I could bump into about what had happened and what was it like. I suddenly thought, I'm a ghoul here. This is an awful tragedy, and I'm trying to talk to people about how do they feel. And I put so much so that I put my recorder, a Ewer tape recorder, it was about that size. I put it down on the steps of one of the terraced houses, and I went and helped the ex-miners who were coming off shift to come and actually use their bare hands, some of them, to try and pull this shale and slurry away to see if anyone was there. And of course, it was pretty hopeless.
By the close of the decade, the eyes of the world turned to Wales once again, but in happier circumstances, the investiture of Prince Charles. In 1969, Wales Today reported on how we might be living in the future. Most of the predictions failed to come true, but one of them was spot on.
In the year 2000, there will still be news bulletins, although in Wales tomorrow, they won't sound exactly like they sound in Wales today.
Can't argue with that, can you? Tomorrow evening, the long, hot summer of 76 and flares, which leads us neatly on to Derek. Back in 1962, Wales Today didn't have its own weather presenter. How times have changed.
Yep, now we couldn't do without you. What would we do?
Well, I feel very much part of the furniture now, but I tell you what, I haven't been here quite as long as Jamie has been.
I joined with John Logie Baird. I've been here that long, yes.
And I'm sure you'll remember this, Jamie, the winter of 1962-63. It was the coldest winter of the century.
Wales Today is 50 years old, and all this week we're bringing you special reports looking back on 5 decades of news broadcasting in Wales. Tonight we reach the 1970s, when we got to grips with decimalisation, enjoyed one of the hottest summers on record, and delighted in the golden years of Welsh rugby. Carwyn Jones has been going through the archives.
One of our most historic landmarks burning beyond repair. 1970 was the year the Britannia Bridge went up in flames.
The fire was started by 5 teenage boys and effectively severed Anglesey's only rail link with the mainland. A bridge that had stood for 120 years was virtually destroyed in one night.
1970 also proved a memorable year for these pupils at St Cadoc's Primary School in Cardiff. They'd saved up their biscuit money to buy an ambulance, and their charitable work attracted a special visitor.
Today, Mother Teresa thanked the youngsters for their help.
This is the first group that I have met where children as small as they are, with such a big heart and such a deep love.
If these children had been saving their money in 1971, they'd have to do a bit of mental arithmetic. It was the year of decimalisation.
£1 is 100 new pennies, 100 new pence to the pound.
Have you had any problems with decimalisation so far?
Oh, slightly, yeah.
What in particular?
Well, I just don't like the idea at all.
By the 1970s, most homes had a television set. But the techniques of broadcasting daily news in Wales were still proving a challenge.
We were using film with a complex sound system. We initially were in black and white, and when I was in North Wales, we had to flick a coin to decide, should we film this in black and white, bring it back to Bangor for transmission from there, or if it was a huge, important event, should we film it in colour and race all the way down to Cardiff with it, because we couldn't process colour in North Wales.
But colour was becoming the norm when it came to filming sporting events. And what better decade than the 70s to enjoy a Welsh rugby squad at the height of its powers.
Oh, I think that period was undoubtedly the golden period. We've got a good side now, but that bunch were just an unbelievable bunch of legends. That's what they became.
As our rugby team basked in the sunshine, so did the rest of us. At least we did in 1976. It became known as the Long Hot Summer, and it changed the life of one young Wales Today viewer.
I was 8 years old at the time, growing up in Barry. We had soaring temperatures, lots of sunshine, a big drought, of course. Our water was turned off for up to 17 hours a day, and I became fascinated by the weather as a young boy, and I knew then that I wanted to be a weatherman when I left school.
1976 was also the birth of punk, and in Wales, the arrival of the Sex Pistols in Caerphilly provoked protests from churchgoers. But it wasn't just the musical climate that was changing. Our economy was also in a state of flux. 1978 saw the closure of the East Moors and Ebbw Vale steelworks. And by the end of the decade, the Shotton plant in Deeside would also shut its gates, leaving nearly 6,000 men without work.
I do remember watching thousands of people come out of the gates of Shotton at the end of the last shift, and it just suddenly occurred to me, my goodness, this is not just a handful of people out of work, but thousands in one fell swoop. It was dramatic.
As the decade drew to a close, Wales went to the polls. In a referendum on St David's Day, 1979, voters rejected devolution by an overwhelming majority of 4-1. Plans for an elected Welsh Assembly would have to wait. That same year, a new Prime Minister entered Downing Street, heralding a new era of politics and a decade of sweeping change. In tomorrow night's programme, we'll be looking at the 1980s, a decade that saw us take to the streets in celebration and in defiance.
Well, we saw him there talking about the 1970s. Let's see if he can predict the future. What have you got for us?
Well, there's definitely no chance of a drought this autumn, Jamie, that's for sure. The reservoirs are nice and full after that wet summer we've had.
Now, Wales Today is 50 years old, and all this week we're bringing you special reports looking back on 5 decades of news broadcasting in Wales. Tonight, we've arrived at the 1980s. Margaret Thatcher was in power, Britain went to war in the Falkland Islands, and striking miners spent a year on the picket lines. Carwyn Jones has been looking back at the stories that made the headlines.
The decade began in celebratory style. The wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer in 1981 attracted huge crowds in London, and those of us who couldn't be there in person were glued to our televisions. Street parties were held up and down the country, like this one in the Rhondda.
We dressed up the street and put all trimmings up.
Taken us 3 months to do it.
And has it been worth it?
Oh, every minute of it, every minute.
The celebrations continued the following year, when 33,000 people gathered at Ninian Park, home of Cardiff City Football Club. They weren't there to watch a match, but to welcome Pope John Paul II, the first reigning Pope to visit Wales.
I have come to proclaim Christ's gospel of peace and reconciliation.
1982 was the year peace was shattered, 8,000 miles away on the Falkland Islands. 255 British servicemen were killed in the conflict, including 32 men from the Welsh Guards who died on board the Sir Galahad. Those who made it back home were given a hero's welcome.
The VC-10 today arrived to an excited welcome with a strong Welsh flavour to greet another party of returning Welsh Guardsmen.
On the night of November the 1st, 1982, television history was made. The launch of S4C finally provided a dedicated Welsh-language TV service. Around the same time, Wales Today was making a few changes of its own. We had new titles, new sets, and new faces.
Good afternoon.
Although not every presenter was happy with their 80s look.
And it's the latest attraction to the skyline at Rhyl.
Probably the trademark was the big hair, and it wasn't permed. Strangely enough, you know, people did think, good Lord, is that Kevin Keegan? Or, you know, I looked as if I was some character out of Miami Vice.
If big hair summed up the 1980s, so too did the microchip. And its leading exponent was unveiling something new at the Hoover factory in Merthyr Tydfil.
Well, the Sinclair C5 was a remarkable episode, if you like. They allowed me to drive it in the streets of Cardiff. And it was horrendous. I remember coming round the corner by the castle with a great big bus or articulated truck on the left of me, and I realised that the driver just no way on earth could he see me down there, lying on my back on the ground in this plastic contraption. And it suddenly dawned on me, this thing's not a runner.
The Sinclair C5 may have been the butt of many a joke, but at least it provided work for these men in Merthyr. And work was becoming hard to find. When the National Coal Board announced the closure of 20 mines across England, Scotland and Wales in 1984, the action that followed became one of the defining news stories of the decade.
The miners' strike, that was a very active story lasting the whole year.
There is no going back. There is no surrender.
It was very, very, very sad to see what happened in the pit villages, which is where I'd spent most of my youth. My father was a mining engineer, and seeing how families were pulled apart, seeing the hardship engendered by the fact that the men just didn't have any money.
The official end of the strike came on the 3rd of March 1985, when a vote was passed to return to work, even without a new agreement between unions and the Coal Board. At Mardy Colliery, the mood was defiant, but the writing was already on the wall. Gradually, the pits began to close, and by the end of the decade, our coal mining industry was in terminal decline. But huge changes were just around the corner. In tomorrow night's programme, we'll be looking at how Wales reinvented itself in the 1990s, the decade of devolution and development, when Cymru became cool.
Yes, looking forward to that tomorrow. But Derek, you remember the 80s, don't you, for some quite dramatic weather?
That's right, Lucy, yes. I remember the blizzard of January 1982, and then, of course, there was the big storm of October 1987.
Sounds very exciting.
Now, don't worry, there's no hurricane heading our way. Well, so Michael Fish tells me anyway.
Now, all this week, we've been bringing you special reports marking 50 years of Wales Today. Tonight, we've reached the 1990s. We voted for devolution, counted the cost of an environmental disaster and mourned the death of a princess. Carwyn Jones reports now on the stories that made the headlines.
In television news, pictures are everything. And these images provided a striking start to a new decade. On the morning of the 26th of February 1990, a combination of gale-force winds and high tides broke down the sea defences at Tywyn in Conwy.
Just a few minutes ago, this water was only a few inches deep. It's now rising at a rate of a foot every 15 minutes.
It was almost a third world calamity that was breaking about us. And I looked up and I saw the RAF rescue helicopter winching people from their homes in the street just beyond me, while the inshore lifeboat was a little bit further up, sailing down the street, pulling people on board. It was a major national and an international story, and obviously still not forgotten by the people of Tywyn.
In the early 90s, an altogether different storm was buffeting the South Wales valleys, a wind of change which split communities apart. The programme of widespread pit closures, which began in the late 80s, was gathering pace, and a way of life was disappearing with it.
300 Mardi miners as they finish their final shifts. They come up from underground, not just leaving behind them the coal they were hewing, but leaving the industry.
You know, if you cast your mind back, whole communities were involved in that industry. They were either miners, or they were engineers, or they worked in the canteen, or they just saw the flurry of cars as people moved on those shifts. At the same time, new jobs were being created. I suppose one of the things that we really noticed was the arrival of Japanese employers, Japanese companies. Ironically, in a decade or so, there were about as many Japanese companies as there had been collieries when I started.
As the pit heads began to disappear from our skyline, a new icon of industry came into view. The second Severn Bridge was opened to traffic in 1996. But the biggest story of that year took place on the Pembrokeshire coastline.
At first light, the Sea Empress was listing badly, with many tugs coming to her aid. The Liberian-registered tanker had been on her way to the Texaco oil refinery at Milford Haven. It's the worst oil spill off the West Wales coast, and occurring in such an environmentally sensitive area raises many questions.
The 31st of August 1997, the single event that defined the decade, when our hearts missed a beat.
Good evening. Wales is in mourning this evening for Diana, Princess of Wales, who has died in hospital following a car crash in Paris.
When she died, the reaction was quite simply extraordinary. To see grown men crying when they were watching the funeral on a big screen was quite sobering, and I can see those images in my mind now.
September the 19th, 1997. In the early hours, history was made.
Good morning. And it is a very good morning in Wales.
The devolution referendum was the closest of races, but the ayes had it. 2 years later, the National Assembly for Wales was officially opened by the Queen. And as the decade drew to a close, Wales seemed to ooze confidence. Cymru had become cool. Music had a new set of stars, and so did meteorology.
And here with the details is a new face to Wales Today, Derek Brockway. Welcome, Derek.
Thanks very much, Jane.
In October 1999, a global audience fixed its eyes on Cardiff as it hosted the Rugby World Cup in the newly built Millennium Stadium. As a new century dawned, it seemed Wales had come of age.
Well, tomorrow night in the final part of the series, we'll be looking back at Wales today in the 21st century. Well, Derek, we saw you there a little younger. What do you remember of that first forecast?
Well, Lucy, obviously I was a bit nervous at the time, and because I was sat down at the Cardiff Weather Centre in those days, I couldn't wave my arms and bend my knees like I do now.
Oh, we'd miss that.
And I wasn't a silver fox then either, like I am now.
Very distinguished.
It's working with Jamie. It's enough to turn anyone grey.
Now, all this week, we've been celebrating 50 years of Wales Today, delving into the archives to bring you the news stories that made the headlines. Tonight, we've reached the 21st century. Fuel protests, foot and mouth, and a new golden age of Welsh rugby. In the last of his reports, Carwyn Jones takes a look back as we look forward to a new millennium.
It was Wales's biggest party. Tens of thousands of us took to the streets to celebrate a new decade, a new century, a new millennium. As dawn broke and the clear-up began, we all wondered whether our technology had survived the night intact.
Come breakfast time on January the 1st, the year 2000, what are the chances of my toaster being infested with millennium bug, and will my kettle work?
Luckily, most computer systems defied the predicted problems with Y2K. But there was widespread disruption later that year. Rising fuel prices led to blockades at oil refineries and queues at the pumps.
Panic-stricken drivers besieged those filling stations that did have fuel. The vast majority are now completely out of unleaded petrol. At this garage in Swansea, commuters could only get their hands on diesel.
Can't work today. Everything comes to a stop, doesn't it? There's no unleaded here, is there?
No, there's no unleaded here.
All right.
While there was gloom on the streets, there was anguish in our countryside. 2001 saw the first foot and mouth outbreak in Wales for more than 30 years.
Minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, things were changing. First of all, straight away, the countryside closed overnight, and to see the effect on the tourist operators was just terrible, because some of them just watched as their businesses, their life businesses, folded. And you could see the community gradually ground to a halt as well, because people were afraid to go out. So everybody was affected, and it was just really awful to witness.
In our capital city, the political landscape was changing. Wales had voted for a National Assembly, and now it needed a home. There were arguments over where it should be, what it should look like, and how long it was taking to build. But on St David's Day 2006, the Queen officially opened the new Senedd building in Cardiff Bay, an event which Wales Today could broadcast thanks to some building work of its own.
Welcome to my floating home. It's certainly a lot warmer. They built a studio actually on the water. Now, there can't be many people who can lay claim to hosting the programme live on water. But I think we can remember, I remember seeing a cameraman, actually, the camera shifting on the autocue once or twice because of the waves.
History of a different kind was being made at the Millennium Stadium. In 2005, Wales won its first Grand Slam for 27 years. And just for good measure, they did it all over again in 2008.
In latter years, I've gone to rugby matches and they all shout, you know, say, hi, Jane, because, of course, they remember those times where I've been saying, you know, Wales has won the Grand Slam, and what a great feeling that was. And, of course, yeah, I think I gained quite a few new fans along the way.
In the 21st century, we saw gradual adjustments to our daily lives. If we went to the pub, we couldn't smoke. If we went shopping, we had to pay for carrier bags. And as the recession took hold, some of those shops began to disappear from our high streets. But it was also an era of technological change. One by one, our analogue television transmitters were switched off. Wales became the UK's first digital nation. Suddenly we had more channels and better reception, meaning we could all enjoy moments like these. It's all a far cry from those early years of Wales Today, when, 50 years ago this week, the first programme was broadcast from a small studio in a converted church.
So there we are, Wales Today, 50 years old this week, which leads us neatly on to Derek Brockway and the weekend weather forecast. What have you got for us?
Well, I can remember watching you on Wales Today when I was in junior school, Jamie.
I was afraid you might say that, yes.
So you must be nearly 60.
I could see that coming.